The truth is, there were some things that I believe were going fundamentally wrong with Jewish education conceptually. Today's generation is summed up by anything. It's their notion that they need to trust the authenticity of the people in their lives and where their information is coming from. And what we saw countless times and time again is young kids who had had really great Jewish educations were hearing about the alternative view of history in a hostile or antagonistic way, and they're turning around saying to their Jewish educators, "You lied to us, you deceived us, you hid stuff from us." The Jewish community can have these conversations about which voices I'm going to platform, which was a red line, who's in the tent and who's out of the tent. I'll tell you something, if I'm a camp counselor, I don't care what their views are on almost anything unless they want to cause harm to somebody else in that bunk. I'm going to love that kid and love their beliefs and treat them as a human being and honor them and their parents and their families almost no matter what.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Long Path Podcast, where we explore the past, present, and future of Jewish life, peoplehood, and Zionism. I'm your host, David Bryfman. Today's guest is David Bryfman. He's the CEO of the Jewish Education Project. He's also a Z3 Institute Fellow and one of the most influential thinkers in the world of Jewish education. For decades, he's worked with educators, schools, and community leaders to rethink how Jewish identity is formed and how the next generation connects to Israel. I'm looking forward to this conversation. A lot has developed over the past couple of years in terms of Jewish education, Israel education. Of course, the war, 10/7, all that has shifted things dramatically. And David has unbelievable insight to what's happening in the field, with also a lot of theory and background. So we're going to talk about some of those developments, how things have shifted and grown. And David, it's just really, really great to have you here with us on this episode.
So great to be here and great to be part of the Z3 Institute.
It's awesome. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. So look, I think, we're going to jump right into it. But in order, I think, to appreciate how things have shifted, if you can maybe give us, we'll start with like a high level of how you perceive things were before 10/7 in terms of Israel education, Jewish education. And that will give us a good kind of compare and contrast situation going on for those who are uninitiated or not so familiar with the state of things.
Look, it's a really important question to start with, because if we go straight into talking about how October 7th changed things, it means that what we're doing is being shifted by other people's events. And I want to take a second just to talk about the state of Jewish education. And in many ways, the biggest part or the biggest problem about describing Jewish education, at least in North America but globally as well, is there is not just one thing as Jewish education. And everybody answers that question by looking at either the school they went to or the school they sent their kids to, or the summer camp, or the youth group, or the Israel trip, or the early childhood center. So to think of there as one type of Jewish education it just doesn't really happen, and not everything is created or ends up being equal. And the other problem with the question in some ways is that we're all experts in education because we all were educated at one stage in our lives. So there aren't too many other professions where just because I had a leaky sink that I now can become a plumber and fix all of the plumbing in my house. Although in today's world and AI, people are doing things that they never thought possible, which is also part of the conversation. So everyone's an expert and everyone thinks that they know. But the truth is that there were some things that I believe were going fundamentally wrong with Jewish education conceptually, but not because of anything that educators were doing wrong. Educators are awesome, and they proved it time and time again, especially during COVID and reacting to October 7th. The vast majority of Jewish educators today work in institutions that were created decades ago in a time which no longer exists, for a population which is completely different, and by and large the expectations haven't changed. So if you actually think that a Jewish day school education should look the same way today as it did in 1950, of course it's not going to work, or a summer camp or a youth group. So the fundamental problem with Jewish education is not anything about education or the educators. We haven't been able to adapt fast enough in this, cliche, the rapidly changing world in which we live. And October 7th hit, and it was a bit of a thud, because then it really shined a light on a lot of things that a lot of us knew were needing of change, but now we had to deal with them in a crisis mode rather than proactively. And just a hint as to the bulk of our conversation, it's never good to respond in education just as a reaction. It's always much better if you're doing it proactively, but that's the conversation we need to be having.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, that's a good rule of thumb. It's better to be, proactive than reactionary. And I like the way you're framing this, how, the context in which a lot of these institutions were developed and the frameworks and the expectations are just not the world in which we're operating. And so I think that's really a great point of departure, because I think it also ties in very nicely with other elements of Z3's work. But we're going to stay today focused on education. So from your perspective, pre-October 7th, the big things that were wrong were the systems, the expectations, and the context in which we thought we were operating. October 7th kind of woke us up. What are some of those failures that came to surface?
Look, I want to say just one thing before I talk about the failures, because it's a bit. We need to understand that the people who created Jewish education in North America had different life experiences than those that are experiencing it today as well. So if I grew up in the era of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, the things that are motivating me to get involved in Jewish education should be very different than what motivates me today. Or when it comes to Israel, if I knew a world without Israel before 1948, or I knew 1973 when Israel's existential existence was really at threat because of the Yom Kippur War, or if I lived through the turmoil of Lebanon, or even the murder, the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, my whole understanding is very different to where the kids are today. And I guess this is the fundamental question that all educators need to ask themselves. Is education about me, the educator, who's really, really smart? Because I went to school and I studied a whole lot of stuff, right? Is my job to tell a whole lot of kids or adults, doesn't matter who the learner is, a whole lot of stuff because they know nothing? And if they know just a little bit more, they're going to be almost as smart as I am? Or is my job as an educator to meet those people where they're at and make sure that what I tell them is relevant to their lives? And those things sounds like polar extremes, but the truth is that every educator who walks into a classroom, deals with this all the time. And anyone who's listening today knows, because they've been in that university lecture hall, or they've been in that congregation where somebody up the front is telling you what you need to know. You've all been in that moment, right? And you've also been in the moment when there's almost zero educational content going on there, but people are just giving you really good food, have a great time, and through osmosis you'll become a little bit more Jewish. So we know the extremes, but as an educator I've got to meet this somewhere in between. And I think by and large the Jewish community was leaning towards, let's engage as many Jews as possible. Let's get them through the doors. Let's do anything we can. We'll even give them free stuff, because free is really, really tempting. And when you do stuff, when you're operating at that level, you lower the barrier, you lower the expectations. And come October 7th, what we realized, we were ignorant. We didn't know enough stuff. And it wasn't that people were saying, I don't have an opinion. It was more that they didn't even know where to turn. So when people started coming to them, attacking them, and we can talk a bit about what that looked like, I was less worried, for example, about the many Jews who were taking stances on issues that I may or may not agree with. I was really concerned about the Jews who had been to Jewish summer camp, been to Jewish day school, been to Hebrew school, who literally said, I don't know how to respond, what to think, what to do, and they just walked away. And that was a situation, by the way, I think at many college campuses. Not the number of Jews were at the encampments or the number of Jews who were protesting for it. The bulk of the Jews at college campuses, we found out, were hiding because they just didn't know what they didn't know, and they didn't feel, they didn't know how to respond. And that's the question I think we needed to really tackle it. What do young people especially need to know? And then when you're facing all of that in somewhat adversity, it becomes problematic. And that adversity issue is a real problem, right? Because October 7th, the attack was on us, but on October 8th and 9th, people already felt like now we were being, somehow seen as the attacker. So it flipped pretty quickly, and we weren't prepared for that.
Yeah. So you named a whole lot of very important pieces that I really do hope we get to cover. But I think what just to tie something there nicely together, I thought that was very, helpful, to name was the two elements that kind of lead to failure, not in failure, some individual failure, but in failure in education is, number one, forgetting the context in which your educators were brought up. And number two, because that will inform their disposition, their priorities, etc. And the number two is, if a good educator understands that there is a story about retelling their own story or using that story to tell for the future. So it's one thing, it's okay. it's good to remember that there's different context, but the educator doesn't even know that their forward is going to be different. Then that's like that's the lower the greatest degree of failure. If an educator was raised in a different era, different context, I mean, even with their own kids, right? Like
Yeah.
I can be a good parent or a good educator or whatever, knowing that my kids are not going to replicate my childhood, and my job is not to replicate it for them, and still not ignore my context. So it's the context and trying to kind of preserve the past, and then that results in you know trying to superimpose a context that doesn't exist with information that doesn't support the context that we're in, and that's I think a massive piece of it.
Well, you touch it like here's really important, right? Because we were asking educators in the aftermath of October 7th to do two things simultaneously, which I think are really difficult, if not impossible. One is you're living through history, right? And two, you're being tasked with creating memory. And that is really, really difficult to do because it was clear to everybody that October 7th was something unexpected, gigantic, something big was taking place.
Yeah.
And then these educators say, firstly, process it yourself really, really quickly. Then talk to your kids in a way where they're able to construct how they're going to memorialize, remember, and take this forward. That's a really, really challenging thing to do. And one of the things I want to try and really get across to all the people that I speak to is that education has to be fundamentally good education. What do I mean by that? Like, many people, when they came to me in the aftermath of October 7, told me, we need our kids to know this, do this, behave this, believe this, whatever. What that really was them saying is that I am an adult and I want more young people to believe, feel the same way I do about all things related to Israel.
In this moment right now.
Right now, really quickly, really, really quickly. Now, that's not a really good educational sense. But before we even get there, it forgets the fact that the adult who says that has had an entire lifetime of their own experiences to reach their own conclusions, viewpoints, understandings, beliefs, opinions, all of those things. They went to camp, they went to school, they read the article, they did everything. The problem with some of those adults, it wasn't just the parents. This was the organized Jewish community, and it was foundations and funders who also said, we believe this and everyone else should believe that. Now, that's not good education.
No.
Good education allows young people especially to reach their own conclusions by having their own experiences, even if they might reach conclusions different to the ones that you hold yourselves, and that's scary. And I understand this. Like, I grew up, I'm an ardent vegetarian. I want my kids to be vegetarian. I understand, like, if someone, I'm a Republican, it would really upset me if my kids turned out to be Democrats. Like, I really understand that you want your kids to be like you. But at a certain point, if you just tell them what they're going to think and do and believe, firstly, that's, called indoctrination and not really good education. And secondly, we've learned from experience that many young people just reject that. They'll walk away completely if they see an adult figure in their life telling them what to do, what to believe, and what to think. So here we have to get back to good Israel education. Still always has to be good education. And that's something that I'm like really, really trying to, ram home to anyone that's willing to listen.
Yeah, what I find interesting there, and I've had these moments, I'm sure you have also as a parent, is no parent, no person, parents is going to want to admit that they are a replication of their own parents, right? And no one's going to say, "Oh, I think this way because I was told to think this way." Like, no, I made up my own mind. I thought my own thoughts, and I reached my own conclusions. And so, it's just to show, it's just to like, I think help people dig a little bit deeper and say, if you want your kids to be like you, that means you have to let them reach their own conclusions, right? In other words, not in terms of what they think in the end, but the process that made you who you are was through this, and that's what you're trying to replicate for students, for kids, right? Is that process, that much longer, slower, with undetermined outcomes, honestly.
Well, yeah. I mean, the good news part of that equation is that, of course, we all know kids that rejected their parents and went the other way on a whole lot of issues. By and large, the parents are still the most influential people in terms of developing the values of their own kids anyway. Kids spend the most amount of time with them. So, statistically, it does play itself out that like progressive families have a higher chance of raising more progressive kids, and the same with conservative families. But yes, you're totally right. The issue with Jewish education, however, is a bit more complicated because so many Jewish families outsource their Jewish education to a third party. Like the parents, for whatever reason, don't feel comfortable or confident or competent enough to do it themselves. So they send their kid to summer camp to get the Jewish bit, or send them to day school. And often the values of the institution they go to, the kid goes there for a whole lot of reasons, but it might be incongruent with the family values. So, we've all had examples where, oh my goodness, the kid wants to celebrate Shabbat when they come back from camp because Camp Shabbat was amazing. And the parents said, I just sent you to camp to have a good time. I didn't want to become more religious. Or like, you went to a Zionist camp and now you actually want to go and live in Israel? Like, that wasn't my plan here. So that's a bit of a piece of the Jewish education equation, which does come into play. So parents should just do more investigation. These things work. So when you send your kids there, even at a young age, whatever's happening, they work.
They work, which is good. I mean, that goes back to what you were saying earlier, that in the end of the day, we have good educators, right? It's not that the educators aren't doing good work. They're doing good work. There are other parts of the puzzle that they're challenged or struggling with, which is great. And we need to figure out that is. And we'll talk about what good education looks like. But I just you did say something interesting, kind of a throwaway line. And I think it's worth just for a minute for people who are listening to us if you can help us clarify. You said that people were living through history and need to create memory at the same time. And I think that there's a distinction there that is very, it's worth explaining and expanding. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. So if you want to kind of expand a little bit.
Look, I'm not the first person to speak about the distinction between history and memory. And for those people who want to explore it further, there are great sources we can link to. And, some of the people, there have literally been books written about this and some really important pieces by, amongst other people, Avram Infeld, who's written a lot about this, and also, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs wrote a lot about this concept as well. But the notion is that Yerushalmi, the original Zachor, is really an important piece that we should all take a really deeper appreciation of. History happens to someone else. History is an objective study of the events which take place maybe in your land, but to another people in another period of time. And we should all be good students of history for a whole lot of reasons. We don't want it to repeat itself. We do want it to repeat, whatever it is. But history happens to someone else. Memory happens to me. Memory is my ability to take in their history and make it mine. So when I sit down at a Passover Seder, I am not telling the story of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt as if it happened to somebody else. I am literally trying to tell the story as if I was there. The most important word for me in the whole Haggadah is ki'ilu, as if I was actually there. And on some levels, that's absurd. Right? As if I was a slave. On other level, as an educator, it's probably the most powerful educational tool I can ever imagine, to simulate in some ways the visceral feeling of what it was actually like to be there, makes that memory mine. That is really complicated because we can talk about other examples in history where I do not want to do that, or bad examples of education where someone has tried to do that. For those of us who grew up as like campers or youth group participants in the 1990s or 2000s, you might remember the simulations of Jews trying to flee Russia or Ethiopia, where we were simulating those conditions. And believe me, you and I can list all of the horrific accounts of bad Holocaust education that we've heard about in our lives as well. Because one thing you said, which is important as well, you did say something to the effect that there are a lot of good educators out there. And I do need to qualify that. There are also not enough good educators out there as well. And the difference between the good educators, those that have gone through some sort of professional development experience or some sort of osmosis experience to become what I consider, and I think you too as well, good educators, is not enough. And in many cases, we are filling educational seats with people who might be experts in subject matter but don't know pedagogy. Or the opposite, they don't know pedagogy or they don't know the content, and they're trying to do things with the young people as well. So I would like to think there are a lot of good educators. This is not disparaging in any way for those that are doing good work, but it's an acknowledgement that it's not even across the board with good educators. One thing else I did hear a lot about, because I just did a lot of study about this, was a lot of young educators especially actually not even young, educators specifically, said they know what to do, right? They know whether they do or not is another question, but they said, we know what to do educationally, but we're not allowed to do it.
Okay.
And that's another really important part of the conversation.
Let's follow that thread for a second, because that's what. So okay, we'll start. So what are the things that they want to do that they're not allowed to? Like, not allowed to. What does that mean?
I am a good educator of history or social studies or political science. It's ingrained in me that I want to teach all issues from multiple perspectives. And that's something that I believe as an educator is good pedagogy, because if I expose someone to this point of view and that point of view, they're able to reach their own conclusions. Even better, they're able to look at a primary text reflecting either a person or a historical text, and I can make up my own mind. So the teachers come into the classroom. I am going to teach. Let's just put out a little example. I am going to teach the War of Independence from multiple perspectives. A small example. And the teacher says, okay, I'm going to teach it from multiple perspectives. And somebody in the school, the principal, the rabbi, the layperson, the foundation, the parent, says, what do you mean you're teaching the other perspective? We come to a Jewish school or a Jewish camp to learn the Jewish perspective, as if there's one Jewish perspective, by the way. But now you're going to introduce the other perspective. You can't do that here. They'll get that. The New York Times, they'll get it. They don't need us to deliver us, the Palestinian narrative on a certain issue. And this is a real problem. In today's day and age, our kids are not stupid. They have access to more knowledge than any other, or information, more access than any generation in history. So as if we're hiding something from them, like they're going to find it anyway. And here's the piece which everybody needs just to really understand. If today's generation is summed up by anything, it's their notion that they need to trust the authenticity of the people in their lives and where their information is coming from. And if they believe somebody is out to dupe them or deceive them, they'll turn the other way. And what we saw countless times and times again is young kids who had really great Jewish education, so we thought, we're hearing about the alternative view of history or the alternative narrative in a hostile or antagonistic way, first at university, now it's happening in high school and middle school, and they're turning around saying to their Jewish educators, you lied to us, you deceived us, you hid stuff from us, as if there weren't a Palestinian people that lost something in the 1948 experience of Israel gaining independence on the Jewish national sovereign land. No one who understands history believes that there was no people living there beforehand. So we hide it almost at our own peril. What we do with that knowledge, that's a whole other question. But to pretend it didn't happen or follow the dictum that it was a people with no land coming to a land with no people, which was one of the famous Zionist sayings of the time, like that's just factually, objectively incorrect. And our young people deserve better. Yeah.
I have a question about this, because I'm very curious about this line of education, because on the one hand, obviously I agree, right? Of course, you need to in any other subject matter that we study Jewishly, we're bringing in, we like to talk about machloket, right? And we bring up opposing perspectives, etc. At the same time, when it comes to machloket, like there are still things within canon, right? There are things that are still outside. So the question is, one, how do we understand that? Because I could not easily, but I can imagine a curriculum that says we're going to go through 48, or at least the founding of the state. I was taught primarily through like the Haganah mindset, right?
Yeah.
But there was Lechi, and there was Etzel, and there was whatever Palmach, and the Altalena as an example of what happened there, right? There's enough of internal discord that creates a sense of or allowing us to ask difficult questions about the narrative without giving that. That's number one. Number two, the piece that I struggle with, honestly, is because obviously I see the value in that, but also there isn't, and then maybe the easy answer here, maybe there's an easy answer, but I can't think of another topic, not Jewish, any topic that isn't appropriately, what's the word I'm looking for, problematized in an age-appropriate way, right? Like when you're a kid, your conception of love is very simple, right? Your conception of money, of friendships, of institutions, establishment, life, etc. Right? Like
Yeah.
So at what point
Okay.
does it become stabilizing? Because from my experience in terms of encountering people, more often than not for me, and David, please correct me if I'm wrong on this or at any point, right? Those who often yell, not in many cases, those who yell, "You lied to me" or whatever, haven't always exhibited the most commitment to the Jewish people.
Good. Okay.
Right? And it's an easy off-ramp. In other words, like I know all the problems. I was raised in Israel. I stood in the roadblocks. I've seen it firsthand. But because of the ingrainment in my core identity, I'm going to question. I'm going to push back. I'm going to fight for a different reality. But that destabilize my identity. I'm not going to look for an off-ramp. You know what I'm saying?
All right. Yeah. Let's go. You've mentioned so many. Let's go through one by one. The first thing is I get asked this a lot about age and developmental appropriateness for the complexity that I'm talking about. Any good educator with any topic knows that anything can be taught to young people at an age appropriate way, and we make decisions about that all the time. That being said, I do believe a lot of Jewish education has been made pediatric for many years, and as our friend and colleague Dr. Sivan Zakai teaches us, young people are capable of learning a lot more things than we give them the ability to do so. That being said, I do want to be pretty clear. If we as a Jewish community are actually going to not be hypocritical and tell our young kids that when they become the age of bar and bat mitzvah, that they are becoming adult members of a community and capable of some sort of critical analysis of their own life and their tradition and the rituals in which we are inviting them to participate, we should also be asked them to critically engage with some of these topics as well. So by and large, I say middle school, bar mitzvah age, let's do it because it has to be done because then there are no excuses.
For sure.
The second thing, right. So the second thing I'll say is this is like, let's just go straight to the hardest issue of all. Yeah. And that is, and I've been pushed back really hard on this and had to think about it a lot. And I say, we need to expose our people to multiplicity of diverse viewpoints. Mm-hmm. And then someone turns around to me and says, what? You really think we should be bringing a Hamas viewpoint into the discourse around October 7th? So my initial reaction is like, please don't distort me and take me to the nth degree. And then I sat back and thought about it and went for a run and thought about the issue. And I said, in the good Holocaust curriculum and the good curriculum about the civil rights movement, there are first-hand accounts from Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan included in those curriculum.
But David, there's a big distinction here.
The time.
Not only it's the time, and that by and large, of course, sadly, it's not entirely true, but for a long time, those ideas were defeated.
Right. Okay.
We're defeated. This is a lot for people. This is life. There's a difference between saying there used to be this perspective, right?
Yes.
Flat Earth. They used to think the world was flat.
Yeah.
It's not, so we could talk about it. But today, yeah.
Right. So there's a difference between holding out the extreme ideological fights that are taking place. But what I actually think people are more scared of is not including an Islamic fundamentalist voice. We call it Hamas or not. That's the distractor here, right? Because to talk about the Jewish world today or the state of Israel today without talking about Islamic fundamentalism, that's a huge mistake. Right. So you need to be able to talk about Iran and its proxies, however you want to talk about it. And I agree, the Hamas example is a red herring and it's extremity, but that's what people are throwing back at me. They're actually more worried about what viewpoints am I willing to consider from within the Jewish community when it comes to these viewpoints. And they're scared that I'm going to you can't include an anti-Zionist in your Israel education program. You can't include a right-wing ultra-nationalist in your... They're actually scared of the extremities of the Jewish viewpoint infiltrating the particular institution that they're trying to establish. And this becomes a really critical piece because one of the things that I want to say is that good Israel education is actually good Jewish education, which is actually good education. And any good education has to have some morality or ethical value when we're engaged in it. I'll give you one of the stranger examples that I've encountered over my life is that when I used to teach Israel studies, one of the rules that I had in my classroom was that you cannot be a racist, you cannot be a xenophobe, you cannot be a homophobe, a misogynist. These are all things that you cannot promote violence. In my classroom, these things are totally unacceptable. And when I came to Israel education, then I was able to say, and if it's a viewpoint that's acceptable in the Knesset, then it's acceptable in my classroom. Well, 20 years later, the viewpoints that I just said were not allowed are like mainstream in the Knesset. So now I have to evaluate. And this is where I get myself into a lot of trouble with certain parts of the Jewish community. But I think I'm coming down, at least with enough personal conviction, that if this thing called Israel education or Zionist education is to succeed, we need to be able to declare it as a moral and ethical, educational and ideological practice. And when we see and notice behaviors that are outside the bounds, we need to be able to call them out. If there are Jews who are trying to destroy the very fabric of the Jewish people by calling themselves whatever label they are, then that's unacceptable. And I also believe if there are Jews trying to distort Judaism and Zionism for their own particular ideological or national views, we need to call that out today as well. And that's a really, really difficult place to actually navigate, especially in today's political climate. But I actually think there's more wherewithal within the Jewish community to actually do that than we actually give ourselves enough credit for.
Yeah, that really resonates, and that helped me kind of organize some of my thoughts around it. I think that, and we'll come back in a minute to like the good Israel's good Jewish, good education kind of schematic that you drew, because I have we did an exercise together several months ago that this kind of part of this emerged, and I want to hear some of the findings of what you around that topic. But in terms of the values, I think this also part of the challenge is there's two parts to it. I think one is and I'm curious to hear your response to this. One is similar to like even October 7th. October 7th was like on full volume, right? Like you're black, but I think there's a sense of we are in history and memory at the same time when it comes to all of this in general, right? Like in the founding of the state, it's just like it's all new, right? We're all, in a way, it's funny. I kind of compare it to it's almost like Forrest Gump, right? In the movie, he's somehow in all these historical moments, right? Like somehow he's in Vietnam, he's in Kennedy's assassination, he's in the civil rights thing, he's in the Olympics, he does everything, right? And I feel like for a lot of us, we've been everywhere, right? Like, I lived through the Intifada, Rabin's assassination, the first Gulf War when I was a kid, the disengagement, the Lebanon War. Like, there's just like it's not and so I think it's hard to kind of like catch up and catch our breath in that sense. I think that's part of one piece of it. The other piece of it, I think, which is the neurosis, right, of like, let's get as many Jews back in the world. We haven't replaced the numbers of the Holocaust, right? And what Simon Rudowitz calls the ever dying people, in the sense that we're the last generation.
Yeah.
And this deep-seated neurosis of how do we not lose the next generation. I think those two kind of pieces are very much determining the direction of a lot.
Look, I'm an educator, and I'm based in a sociological understanding of education, and I try to avoid even going near being an expert on anything other than the educational piece, and it's really tempting to do so. But in my sociology of the Jewish people, I once spoke with a prominent sociologist about this, and I said, you know what? There are two types of Jews in the world that are connected to the Jewish community. Okay. And they're really clear. There are those that believe the whole world is out to get us, and there are those that believe we're going to thrive no matter what, and we're going to overcome everything. And on political, on religious, on practice, you can actually divide the Jews up on many of those, on that axis alone. Yeah. And in some ways, the viewpoint you presented is becoming more attached to an older generation than it is to the younger generation, especially when we're talking about the vast majority of North American Jews who consider themselves to be social progressive. And in that way, no matter how much they hear about the existential threat of Iran, no matter how much they hear about anti-Semitic attacks in Australia or London or Michigan, they still believe fundamentally that America is a good place, if not the best place in the world, to raise themselves with a Jewish family, regardless of anything that you point towards them. And they might be right or they might be wrong, and the strong Zionists will say, you're kidding yourself, because don't you remember what happened to the Spanish Jews and the German Jews, and history just like is so obvious. And then I'll turn around and say, like, coming from an October 7th Israel, that's not such a promising proposition to actually put out there. But at least now we have an army. And I'll say to them, at least here we have a constitution. So we can have these discussions, and sometimes people's worldviews are just that, they're worldviews. I do believe, however, that education has to be talking a different language than the Jewish community around us. Like, the Jewish community can have these conversations about which voices I'm going to platform, which was a red line, who's in the tent and who's out of the tent. But I'll tell you something, if I'm a camp counselor and a kid's in my bunk, I don't care what their views are on almost anything unless they want to cause harm to somebody else in that bunk. I'm going to love that kid and love their beliefs and treat them as a human being and honor them and their parents and their families almost no matter what. Because who am I to say to that young kid, because you don't like X, you don't belong in my camp, which is proxy for you don't belong in the Jewish community.
Right.
Every kid is more valuable to me than the one before. And in that way, all of these discussions, I'm a peoplehood tragic in terms of nothing else is more important to me than the collective Jewish people. And how dare we as educators be the ones to set up the guardrails to determine who's in and who's out. And I understand why others need to do that. I think they need to do that. But for me, that's the sacred part of as my role as a Jewish educator.
Right, because ultimately, I think, and I love that, and it really resonates, and it's very comforting to hear that and not only but you and others as well, who are in large part, shaping the conversation around education, understand the value of children because and allowing them to feel welcome regardless. Because I think ultimately, this goes, we've been saying this, kind of circling this point, and while we can't tell the future, the likelihood of them trying and wanting to be part of this community long term and being able to transmit the values that they find, Jewishly meaningful is dependent entirely on what they get when they're kids and the education and the tools and that are in their disposition. And it's not about indoctrination. So I mean, this brings really nicely to this question of, what is good education? Because when we did this conversation, and I found it again, and this could be, it is my personal bias, obviously. We were asked to draw, if we had to, it was a certain, like, how Jewish education in relation to Israel education, right? And I was like, I don't understand the question.
Right.
I'm like, it's the entire overlap. It's like, it's a piece inside it. So, can you maybe walk us through, like, what does that mean? Good Israel is good Jewish education. Just let's unpack it a bit.
So let me start off with my punchline, then I'll work backwards. The punchline is that I believe that all good, comprehensive Jewish education must include Israel education. All good, comprehensive Jewish education must include Israel education. It also must include God and Tefillah and Jewish history and Hebrew language and oral law and all of those things. But Israel must be integral to that Jewish educational experience. And you might say, well, that's what I thought was happening. Well, no. In many, many, many Jewish educational institutions, Israel was treated as an option, an add-on, an elective, a day of Israel at summer camp, an 11th grade elective once they've already gone through their full curriculum in a day school, the trip they do as an add-on, the Yom HaAtzmaut celebration once a year. And we were saying no. If we think this thing is important, it needs to be integral from the earliest age to the oldest age of Jewish educational experiences. As part of your study of Torah, you are talking about your connection to Israel and Zionism. As part of your Hebrew language, as part of your social studies, whatever it is, Israel is integral to everything. And then, obviously, someone says to me, well, what about the Jews who don't believe that? And I say to them, listen, I'm walking into a JCC and I'm being asked to teach a course on 101 Judaism. I know, no offense to JCCs, it's just who many JCCs represent. Many of those people in that room do not believe in God. They don't pray. But I'm asked to teach a course on Judaism 101. I am still going to teach them about God and how to pray. They can choose to do it, not to do it, be against it, fight against it, but they need to know it. And the same way, you need to know about Israel, its history and the current reality in order to be part of what I think is the greater Jewish collective, if for no other reasons than more than half the Jewish world's population live there, and the Jewish history is intrinsically bound to that piece of land. Those two things alone mean that you cannot be, in my opinion, a committed Jew today without at least knowing about that. Whether you reject it or not is what you want to do with that information. But that is integral to all good Jewish education today, and I don't think it's an option. I've heard about Hebrew schools, for example, have decided it's too complicated, so we don't talk about Israel. You're wrong.
Yeah.
I have to say it, like, you're wrong. And October 7th proved to most of them they're wrong, because every one of those kids then came to Hebrew school wanting to know what was happening and why people were looking at them and asking them certain questions because they were Jewish. And this is just now we have to accept it if we didn't know. And this is one of the October 7th wake-up calls for world Jewry. If you thought your life was totally disconnected from what was taking place in Israel pre-October 7th, it is blatantly obvious after October 7th. It's about what happens there affects us here. Not always in a negative way, by the way. I know everyone will talk about anti-Semitism and all of the stuff. That's important, but it's not just the negative, because the heightened sense of Jewish and Israel awareness after October 7th, some people call it the surge, is also very real. Many people's Jewish, like their kishkas, their guts was ignited by this sense of Jewish people. And the example of that, the unfortunate example of that, with some, shining light amidst all of the tragedy, was the issue of the hostages.
Right.
The issue of the hostages was a Jewish peoplehood issue. And we celebrated when they were returned alive, even when they were returned deceased. We cried when we found out about some of them had been killed. And to their credit, and this is really important, it was a particularly Jewish issue. But others, including Rachel Goldberg Polin, reminded us there were non-Jews and non-Israelis. It was also a humanitarian issue. And we don't need to choose. I can love my Jewish people and love the world at the same time. This binary between universal and particularism was another one of the fallacies that October 7th, I think, really shined a light on as well. So, I think that we need to have a conception that this Israel thing, it ain't going away, despite what some people might want. It's part and parcel of who we are historically, in the present, and into the future. And I think anybody who is saying that they cannot teach Israel but still claim to be giving a full Jewish education, I actually think they're deluding themselves and doing a real disservice to their students.
That very much tracks. I mean, of course, look, I grew up in Israel. I don't even know how to separate the two. For me, the identity, the Jewish, the Israel, all.
By the way, the Israelis have a harder part with the Jewish equation many times.
Absolutely. Which is, my history, my professional one in terms of teaching Israelis about diaspora Jewry and the importance of understanding of what diaspora richness. There's a lot of that conversation as well. But it's focusing here in North America, this side of like Israel is there. I tell people you're like 2,000 years. Our grandparents and their grandparents had a relationship with Israel before it existed. Now that it exists, now's the time to pull back. Now's the moment we're going to say we don't want to do anything to do with this thing. I just find it's just weird.
Amitai, do you use the word diaspora when describing Jewish life outside of Israel?
I use all kinds of words depending on what I'm talking about. I certainly don't use exile.
Yeah.
I don't call it. This comes up sometimes writing documents like, diasporic Judaism or Jews.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's not. It's different. I mean, I think there's also Jews who live in Israel who have a diasporic mindset. That's a whole other conversation, right? Like, so. Yeah. What would you use? What would you?
It's one of my missions that I'm not getting involved with, but I think it's important, like linguistically, that most Jews who live outside of Israel are living in Jewish communities around the world or in part of global Jewry. They don't look at themselves every day and say, "Oh, my Jewish life here is defined by the fact that I am not living in that other country, of Zion." And that there are some who are, Zionists who might aspire to that. But, if we're looking at North American Jewry today, by and large, the vast majority do not qualify their own Judaism by their relationship only with Israel. It's certainly a part of it, but they're a part of the global Jewish people rather than a community that should be defined by the physical relationship outside of Israel. Anyway, that's another topic, right?
No, it's another topic. I mean, you're tempting me because there is a whole conversation. Rudowitz is one of my favorites on this, but he had a whole exchange of letters with Ben Gurion about the name of the country, right? Because it's like this.
Just by the way, why I think it's actually important is because when you're educating Jews today, if you're trying to define their ideology or their belief system or their identity structure by what they're not, it's not a really good value proposition.
In general, anything.
Fine, exactly right.
But that goes the point. Good Jewish education, good Israel education is good education. It's just that doesn't. Yeah.
can I use this as another like really important tangent here about the word Zionism?
Yeah.
Because it's really important as well. Because the word Zionism for many Americans has been distorted by people that are trying to give it a synonym with something that it's not. Like there's a whole discussion: should anti-Zionism have a hyphen in it or not have a hyphen in it? And the truth is, much of the discourse around the Zionism is not the Zionism that you and I grew up with, and certainly not that which defines the Z3 Institute. But I want to argue something different that, yes, for many people, the word Zionism has been distorted by the other, who call it genocide, apartheid, colonialist, imperialist, whatever it might be. But I don't think the Jewish community has done a really good service of educating about what Zionism is either.
Oh,
And
I
here I
agree.
would explicitly say Zionisms,
I agree. I could
the
not agree.
multiplicity. Because if
Yes.
you only leave it to what the kids and young people are hearing about Zionism from social media or media, they're hearing a particular viewpoint about Zionism, which I think is a distortion of what this Jewish national enterprise was about. And it's not appealing.
Yeah, I agree. I would frame it a little differently. If
Yeah.
you'll humor me for a second, I would say there's one Zionism, but many applications of it. And I think the one Zionism is the sense of Jewish agency and authorship over our future. And then the application depends on context, place, and time, and you can do it differently.
It's interesting. Today, with our staff, for part of our Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations, we
Yeah.
read the Declaration of Independence together. And it's like, when you read a text, you always find out something. Oh,
Yeah.
I never knew that before. Like, I didn't realize that Theodore Herzl is the only person named by name in the Declaration of Independence. And like,
It's not an accident, though. The Herzlian version of Zionism won. Thank goodness we have a country, but that wasn't the only one. There was competing ideas, but it was an
right,
application.
I tell you,
But
like,
it,
yeah.
it, you're
Because he
right.
was so, it's like because he was so parv, he gets to be mentioned.
Yeah.
Like because he was Zionism for everyone, we can include him.
Yeah.
If he had a particular viewpoint, then he'd be a bit too. I don't know. It was just interesting to see that. I don't know if they needed to name him. I would have been more comfortable naming Avram maybe than I would have been naming Theodore Herzl in that document.
Yeah. Well, he look. I think the Zionist. I mean, we're opening here all kinds of cans of worms and interesting tangents, but I think part of the, especially Ben Gurion and his ilk of trying to substitute or upgrade Judaism into a civic identity needed different prophets and different people to rely on.
Yeah.
And even if it's in the same line of things, right? Of it's not like ex nihilo we have something going on in a country. We need a new kind of figure that we can say this is these are the people, this is the movement, whatever. Different conversations.
But can I tell you something weird that we
Yeah.
discovered, like more related to 2026 and 1897?
Yeah.
Like when we spoke to a whole lot of people, educators and students and the like, who described themselves as non-Zionists.
Right.
Let's leave the anti-Zionists out of the equation just for a second. The non-Zionists, who I believe are the bulk of when people talk about the Jews that are against, are actually non-Zionists. When I spoke to them, offering them an alternate definition of what Zionism is was really important. But even without doing that, because people can label themselves whatever they like, it's not my job to change people's labels. I found out pretty quickly that most of the people that define themselves as non-Zionist would feel really, really comfortable on any given Saturday night in Tel Aviv, waving an Israeli flag, protesting the actions of the current Israeli government.
Yeah.
Like, all right, you're a Zionist by my
Yeah.
understanding. Like the JFNA studies, right? Just because you disagree with that, the fact that you care enough to actually dislike something that's taking place in the Jewish and democratic homeland of the Jewish people, like, all right, you're in my tent, whether you call yourself the Zionist or not. So the label become, maybe it's a distraction, maybe it's a red herring. But I think that's an important lesson for us because as educators, that's my failing, right?
Yeah.
I have failed to let those young people know that there is this Jewish nationalism which they can identify with and let's put it bluntly, should not be framed by some of the loud Zionist voices on social media who are advocating for what I think are value systems which are antithetical to where the vast majority of American Jews are today. And that's a real dilemma that we need to confront and be able to say out loud.
I agree 1,000,000,000%. I agree. To me, it's almost trivial. In other words, like Zionism, that's the whole point. We need to argue about who we want to be. We have to we get to decide, not let others, whether they're within our camp or outside our camp. That's the core move, right? You want to be a Zionist, then you decide what Jewish life looks like. Okay, that's what it means. Don't let others determine for you. That's the big shift, I think.
Can I give our listeners like a couple of real life examples when like the
Sure.
rubber hits the road? I know.
Yeah.
Here's one, and we gave this at a conference, and it caused a lot of controversy. There are some Jewish institutions which are debating whether or not they should or should not have the Israeli flag in their building. Not because they don't believe in Israel, not because they don't want the flag, but they know because having the Israeli flag in their building will mean some people will not come there for Shabbat dinner.
Yeah.
And what's more important for them, to have the kids come there for a Shabbat dinner or to be staunch and have the Israeli flag there? Oh, I heard another story about a Hebrew school where some teachers turned up one day to Hebrew school wearing keffiyehs and watermelon earrings and T-shirts to school. And, this was really confronting for the school. The school had decided in the past they're not going to deal with Israel because it's too difficult. These teachers come there. Why are you wearing this pro-Palestinian stuff? The principal says to them, said, because you taught me part of our Jewish values and tradition is to stand up for the oppressed. And when somebody is being victimized, it's our responsibility and role as Jews to be able to stand up for their rights. Couple of learnings. One, the school didn't have a policy about dress code beforehand. And they didn't teach about Israel beforehand. The school realized, okay, we made a mistake. We now need to do that.
Yeah.
What did the school do with those teachers? It's a good question. They could have gone either way. The school ended up firing 50% of their staff. Why? Not necessarily because of their views about the Palestinian plight and the occupation, but because the teachers did not understand that their role as educators was not to be the ones to purvey their political and ideological opinions on their students, and the clothing was a way of actually doing just that, that their role was actually to be broader and expose kids rather than to be what we called earlier on as an indoctrinating force.
Yeah.
That's when I talk about good education, that I really commend the principle, like, yes, you get it. That's what the purpose of education needs to be, whether it's by a flag or a shirt or an earring, or it's actually the curriculum as well.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears for a second because you are about to your book's about to go live, which is very exciting, and I want to just spend a couple minutes talking about the book because we're going to obviously the Z3 Institute book, Jewish Education Project, all that, the institutional backing, of course, but what's the book about? Why now? What did you learn?
I'll be totally honest with anyone who ever asks me about why I wrote the book, and it's an important message. I was fortunate enough to take a 3-month sabbatical after many years doing the work, but really 3 years dealing directly with October 7th, and I hadn't taken the time for myself to decompress, to understand, to get in touch with my own attitudes, responsibilities when it came towards Israel and Israel education. And it's something that I encourage all educators to do. Like when someone asks an educator, how do you feel? Like there's a double responsibility there. One, like how do you feel? But I do not believe you can become a good educator unless you've actually dealt with your own emotions. Yeah. So that's how the process started. And then I just started writing. And then I couldn't stop. And I realized there was so much stuff inside of me which needed to get out. Whether it was going to be published or not, I had no idea at the time. But I basically came to the following conclusion, which was that I'd been to Israel about a dozen times in those 2.5 years since October 7th. And Israelis have multiple opinions about anything and reactions. But the one thing they all had in common was that Israel was forever changed since October 7th. I don't know if that's true or not true historically, whether that even matters or not. But the fact that every Israeli was saying that to me meant, how could we in all good consciousness, as Jews living in outside of Israel, I was about to say diaspora, and as Israel educators, believe that if Israel is forever changed, that Israel education shouldn't also be forced to at least look at the issues which they need to confront, or we need to confront after October 7th. So I tried to go down this process of trying to explain this book is not a manifesto. It's a marker in time of one educator who's had a whole lot of different experiences. I blended in my personal biography with, I think, one of the biggest questions for Israel and Jewish educators today, and offer it as a challenge that if you want to be offering a good Jewish education today, these are the things that you need to be thinking about, both as an educator and perhaps more importantly, as the supporters of Jewish education. If you are a board member, if you are a parent, if you are a funder, if you are an organization that houses Jewish education, you need to understand what educators are going through, because the rules of education are different to the rules of the community. They need to be. We need to allow young people the time and space to reach their own conclusions. That's the good education piece. And I felt that this book was like just a moment in time to shout out as loud as I could. And I pushed them. I didn't realize how sensitive some of the issues were until people started reading it. I pushed some raw nerves, but nothing that I wrote in there were not conversations that you and I and many other educators have been having behind closed doors for a long time now, and certainly since October 7th. And I wanted to try and bring them to communal conversation and discourse. And it's running parallel to a broader process that we're doing here at the Jewish Education Project, literally called Reimagining Israel Education. So the two things go side by side. But I think the time is now to actually look at some of these issues. And I want the book to be a conversation starter. I don't expect everyone to agree. I hope everyone doesn't agree with me.
Right.
Firstly, if I wrote something that everyone agreed with, it means that I didn't push the boundaries enough. If I wrote something that no one agreed with, then I wouldn't be regarded as an educational leader. So I'm trying to push some buttons and encourage conversations and disagreements and arguments. There's no right or wrong here. There's just business as usual can't go on.
No, everything is, tying back to the beginning, the context in which we're operating, where we were brought up even as educators, as parents, as humans, has changed dramatically. If not even the extent of the attack, the scope, all that, and also the response in the world. I think it's unbelievable. Even, there's what we're seeing in social media yesterday. I mean, I don't like timing these episodes and kind of, when it was recorded, but so this is going to come out soon. Yesterday was, this whole thing with, that Subway, the Subway series where, what's your hot take? No, that whole thing with, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's truly remarkable. Look, David, we're coming towards the end of the time. This has been incredibly rich, and I can go on for a long time, but I want to be respectful of yours and our listeners as well. We talked about good education, talked about Jewish education, Israel education. The name of this of the podcast, right? The long path podcast is we're trying to encourage people to remember that these things don't happen overnight. Things take time. We've been on this journey for several thousand years at this point as a people. And if maybe you get a parting thought about which, in terms of like if we're thinking about the direction in which we're going, okay, what are things what's the things that need to change so we are now back on where we should be going trajectory wise, and if not, what's at stake?
I don't know if there's just one thing, but I'm going to say one thing which I think both for me and the book and the work is the most important piece for me. And that is that I do not believe that the way the Jewish community is functioning today is at its optimal. I actually think at times it's absolutely embarrassing and disgraceful. The language that Jews use to talk and refer to one another is in many cases absolutely embarrassing and disgusting. And I think it's personal, it's vicious, it's pushing people out, all the things that I do not want the Jewish people to be. Now, I can shout here as a Jewish educator and say, naughty, naughty, don't use that language. And some of the language, by the way, I mean, when I hear one Jew refer to another Jew as a Nazi or as a capo or you should be excommunicated, like this is real. I'm talking mainstream.
Yeah.
This is not fringe anymore. Like, I saw this, literally I was reading it. I had to read it like 5 times. Like, one of the major Jewish newspapers actually quoted somebody as calling another Jew the R word because they didn't agree with their views on a particular issue. I'm like, what is happening to us as a people? So, one, my educational institutions and your educational institutions have to be better than that. Have to be. I can't accept that language in my classroom, my camp, my Hillel, whatever it might be. Never. It's not tolerable. And maybe, just maybe, if we create a young generation who becomes accustomed to new sets of norms, then maybe we'll become a better Jewish community in the future. And for me, like, that's when, like, I don't want to put too much burden and responsibility on Jewish educators, but hey, you chose this profession, and I guarantee you didn't choose it for the parnasa, the economic deliverables that it might not give you. You chose it because you believe in it, and ultimately I think this is what's critical, mission critical for the Jewish people. We can be better, we must be better. And Israel education in Israel has the ability to tear us apart. Inconceivable, given that in the 1940s and 50s it was what galvanized so many of us. But, I can't imagine that this is going to be the thing which tears us apart. We can do better. We must do better. And education is, I don't know if it's the only tool, but for me, it's the most powerful tool that we have to rectify that particular issue. And that would be like, if that comes as any of this conversation, then I would be like, that's where I would like it to be.
David, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Long Path Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. So much to learn. I can't wait for your book to come out.
Neither can I.
I'm excited for future conversations.
Amitai, thank you. Thank you to all of you at Z3, or as I like to sometimes say, Z3 Institute. Like this is urgent, and it's it's mission critical for the Jewish people. So thank you for all that you do as well.
Thank you. So that was a great episode. And with David Bryfman, the head of the Jewish Education Project, we covered a lot of ground very quickly, and there are many, many takeaways. But one that specifically stuck with me is that we need to remind ourselves that the frameworks, the institutions, the paradigms, but in the context of this conversation, the educational material, content, and approaches that have brought us to this moment might not be appropriate and necessary that will take us into our future in terms of a broader Jewish community. That's my main takeaway for today. My question for you today is, what was the most important educational moment for you, and why? Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Long Path Podcast. I'm your host, Amitai Freeman. Today's guest was David Bryfman. He's the head of the Jewish Education Project and a Z3 Fellow. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about Israel education, Jewish education, his new book, and I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to thank our production team for making this happen. I couldn't have done it without them. And please give us a follow on the various platforms. Share this with someone who you think might find this interesting. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Long Path Podcast. I'm Amitai Freeman. Have a good day.